The sky turned black at exactly 3 in the afternoon. Jake Martinez was fixing a broken machine at the factory when the lights went out and every phone started screaming with emergency alerts and the ground shook like an earthquake, but there was no earthquake because the massive alien ships had just appeared over every major city on Earth, and they blocked out the sun with their dark metal holes that stretched for miles in every direction. Jake dropped his wrench and ran outside with everyone else and looked up at the impossible sight hanging in the Detroit sky, and the ship was so big it made the tallest buildings look like toys, and it was covered in strange lights that pulsed like a heartbeat and made a low humming sound that he could feel in his bones. All around him people were screaming and crying and pointing at the sky, but Jake just stood there feeling nothing because he had been feeling nothing for months now, ever since Lisa died from the cancer that the insurance company said they would not pay to treat, and then Emma got killed by that drunk driver just 3 weeks ago. And now there was nothing left inside him except empty space and anger. The alien voice came from everywhere at once, speaking perfect English through every speaker and every phone and every radio in the world, and it said they were the Zephyrian Empire and they had conquered 17 star systems over the past 300 years, and now it was Earth's turn to join their empire or be destroyed. Jake walked back into the factory while everyone else kept staring at the sky, and he sat down on a box and listened to the alien explain their rules and their traditions, because what else was he going to do, and where else was he going to go when his apartment was empty and his family was dead and his life was over anyway? The aliens said they did not believe in war because war was wasteful and messy and killed too many people who could be useful slaves instead. So they had a better way to decide who would rule and who would serve, and it was simple and clean and had worked perfectly for centuries. One champion from each side would fight in single combat, and the winner would decide the fate of both worlds. And if Earth's champion won, then the Zephyrians would leave forever and never return, but if their champion won, then humanity would become slaves and serve the Empire for all time. Their champion was named Kethfer the Unbroken, and he had never lost a fight in 300 years, and he had killed the greatest warriors from dozens of different worlds, and some of those warriors had been giants with 4 arms, and some had been made of living metal, and some could breathe fire, but all of them had died under his claws. Earth had 7 days to choose their champion, and the fight would happen in a place of the Zephyrians' choosing, and it would be broadcast to every world in their empire so everyone could see humanity fall and know that resistance was pointless. Jake finished his shift even though most people had gone home to be with their families, and he walked through the empty streets to his apartment building and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and unlocked his door and sat down at his kitchen table where he always sat now that a television was talking about emergency meetings and world leaders and military experts trying to decide who should fight for humanity, and they showed pictures of special forces, soldiers and martial arts champions and genetically enhanced super soldiers who had been created in secret labs. Jake looked at the wedding photo on his table where Lisa was smiling in her white dress, and he was smiling too back when he could still smile, and next to it was Emma's school picture from last year where she was missing her front teeth and grinning like the whole world was wonderful. He opened a beer and drank it while the news people talked about Earth's greatest fighters and how they were gathering in Washington to be tested and evaluated because humanity needed the perfect warrior to face this impossible threat. Reporters interviewed generals who said they had soldiers who could bench press a car, and scientists who said they had created people with reflexes faster than any normal human, and martial arts masters who said they had studied every fighting style known to man. Jake finished his beer and opened another one and thought about how none of that mattered, because he had seen enough fighting in Afghanistan to know that the best fighters were not always the strongest or the fastest or the most skilled, but sometimes they were just the ones who had nothing left to lose. Outside his window, the alien ship hung in the sky like a black mountain, and its lights pulsed in patterns that probably meant something to the creatures inside, but looked like nothing to him, except maybe like Lisa's heart monitor in the hospital when it was still beeping. And he still had hoped the news switched to interviews with people on the street, and they were all scared and crying and talking about their children and their futures and what would happen if humanity lost. But Jake had no children anymore, and no future, and nothing left to lose. He finished his second beer and looked at the photos again and remembered Lisa telling him she was scared when the cancer came back, and Emma asking him why Mummy had to go away, and how he had promised them both that everything would be okay, but he had been wrong about that, just like he had been wrong about everything else there. Television kept talking about champions and heroes and hope, but Jake turned it off and sat in the darkness listening to the alien ship humming in the sky and feeling the empty space inside his chest where his heart used to be. 7 days to choose a champion, and everyone was looking for a hero, but Jake knew something they did not know, which was that sometimes the best fighters were not heroes at all, but just broken people who had already lost everything that mattered. 6 days passed, and Jake watched the news because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, and they showed all the greatest fighters on Earth gathering in Washington like some kind of superhero convention, but with real weapons and real scars. Captain Alex Hunter was the favorite, and he looked like something from a movie with his perfect muscles, and his cybernetic eye that glowed blue in the dark, and his arms that had been replaced with metal ones that could crush steel, and his reflexes that had been enhanced with computer chips in his brain. The news people loved him, and they showed videos of him fighting 10 men at once and winning and lifting cars over his head, and moving so fast the cameras could barely follow him, and everyone said he was humanity's best hope because he had been designed specifically to be the perfect soldier. Jake sat in his kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like nothing and watching Hunter give interviews where he talked about duty and honor and protecting the innocent and serving humanity and all the things that soldiers were supposed to say, but Jake had been a soldier once too, and he knew that duty and honor did not mean much when you were watching your wife die slowly because some insurance executive decided her life was not worth the cost. The other candidates were impressive too, and there was Elena Rodriguez, who had won every martial arts tournament for the past 5 years and could break concrete blocks with her bare hands, and Danny Kim, who had been born with some kind of genetic mutation that made him stronger and faster than normal humans, and Marcus Washington, who had been a Navy SEAL for 15 years and had more confirmed kills than anyone wanted to count. They tested them all on live television, and they ran obstacle courses and lifted weights and fought against robots and each other, and the commentators kept score like it was some kind of game show where the prize was the survival of the human race. Jake turned off the television and walked to the grocery store to buy more beer, but the streets were mostly empty because everyone was either watching the tests or preparing for the end of the world, and the few people he saw looked at him strangely because he was not running around panicking like everyone else sat. The store, the clerk was a kid named Bobby, who had always been friendly, but now he looked scared and kept glancing at the ceiling like the aliens might come crashing through at any moment, and he asked Jake if he thought humanity had a chance. Jake paid for his beer and looked at Bobby's young face and thought about Emma at that age when she still believed that grown-ups could fix anything and protect everyone. And he almost told Bobby the truth, which was that champions and heroes were just stories people told themselves to feel better, but instead he said that humanity always found a way. That night Jake dreamed about Lisa and Emma, and they were sitting at the kitchen table like they used to do for dinner, and Lisa was laughing at something Emma had said about her teacher, and Emma was trying to eat spaghetti without getting sauce on her school uniform. When he woke up, the apartment was still empty, and the alien ship was still hanging in the sky, and his coffee still tasted like nothing, but now there was something different in his chest where the empty space had been, and it was not hope, because hope was for people who still had something to live for, but it was something else. On the 7th day, they announced that Captain Alex Hunter had been chosen as humanity's champion, and he gave a speech about how he would not let humanity down, and how he had trained his whole life for this moment, and how he would fight with the strength of every person on Earth. The aliens responded immediately and said that the combat would take place at noon in Central Park in New York City, and they would construct their traditional arena and broadcast the fight to every world in their empire so all their slaves could watch another species. Feldrick watched Hunter board a military transport to New York, surrounded by generals and scientists and reporters, and everyone was cheering and waving flags like it was some kind of celebration instead of a funeral. He turned off the television and looked at the photos on his table and touched Lisa's face through the glass and remembered her voice saying his name and Emma's laugh when he used to chase her around the apartment making monster noises. Jake stood up and walked to his closet and put on his best jeans and a clean t-shirt and his old Marine Corps dog tags that he had not worn since he got out of the service, and he looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who had nothing left to lose. He walked outside and the alien ship was still there, blocking out the sun, and he could feel its presence pressing down on him like a weight, but he was already carrying the weight of dead family and broken promises, so a little more did not matter. Jake got in his old truck and drove toward New York City, and the radio was full of people talking about the fight and analyzing Hunter's chances and discussing strategy, but Jake turned it off because strategy was for people who planned to survive, and he was not planning anything except to do what needed to be done. The Highways were packed with people trying to get to New York to watch the fight and others trying to get away, in case something went wrong, and Jake drove through them all at exactly the speed limit because he was not in a hurry to get anywhere. Anymore, he reached the city just as they were setting up the arena in Central Park, and he could see the alien construction machines floating in the air like giant metal insects, and they were building something that looked like a cross between a boxing ring and an ancient coliseum. Security was everywhere, and they had barriers set up to keep people back. But Jake walked right past them like they were not there, and when the guards tried to stop him, he just kept walking, and they grabbed his arms, but he shook them off and kept moving toward the arena more. Guards came running, and they had weapons. And they were shouting at him to stop, but Jake did not stop because stopping was for people who cared about consequences, and he was beyond consequences. Now he reached the inner perimeter where the officials were gathered, and Captain Hunter was doing warm-up exercises, and Jake walked up to the alien delegation and looked at their leader, who was tall and gray with too many eyes. Jake said he wanted to fight their champion instead of Hunter, and the aliens looked at him like he was insane, and the humans looked at him like he was insane, and maybe they were all right, but insanity was just another word for having nothing left to lose. The alien leader spoke in a voice like grinding metal and asked why this ordinary human thought he could challenge their greatest warrior, and Jake looked at the creature and said, because someone had to. Hunter stepped forward and said this was his fight and his responsibility, and Jake looked at the perfect soldier with his enhanced body and his noble intentions and said that duty was a luxury for people who still had families to go home to. The aliens thought it was funny that this ordinary human wanted to replace their chosen champion, and their leader made a sound that might have been laughter, and said that if humanity wished to send a weaker fighter, then they would gladly accept, because it would make their victory even more complete. Captain Hunter argued, and the generals argued, and the scientists argued, but Jake just stood there waiting while they decided his fate, and the alien leader watched him with those too many eyes, like he was some kind of interesting insect. The aliens said that, according to their ancient laws, any member of a species could serve as champion if they volunteered freely, and Jake had volunteered so the combat would proceed, but the aliens wanted everyone to understand that this human would die horribly, and quickly Hunter grabbed Jake's arm and asked him what he thought he was doing, and if he understood that this was not some bar fight but a battle for the survival of humanity, and Jake looked at the soldier's earnest face and said he understood perfectly. Jake walked away from the arguing humans and sat down on a bench while the aliens finished building their arena, and he watched the construction machines place the final pieces and activate the energy barriers that would keep the crowd safe from whatever happened inside. The arena was a circle about 50 feet across with a raised platform in the center, and it was surrounded by walls of pure energy that shimmered like heat waves, and above it floated cameras that would broadcast the fight to every world. In the Zephyrian Empire, people were gathering in the park despite the security barriers, and they came in buses and cars and on foot from all over the city and all over the world because they wanted to see history being made, even if it was the history of their own defeat. Jake could hear them talking and crying and praying, and some of them were angry that he had replaced Hunter, and some of them just looked confused because he did not look like anyone's idea of a champion. A reporter tried to interview him and asked him about his training and his strategy and his confidence level, and Jake told her he was just a guy from Detroit who fixed machines, and she asked him why he thought he could defeat an alien warrior who had never lost a fight. Jake said he did not think anything, and she asked him what that meant, and he said it meant he was going to walk into that arena and do what needed to be done, and she asked him if he was afraid. He looked at her young face and her hopeful eyes, and he thought about Emma asking him if monsters were real, and him telling her that monsters were just pretend, but he had been wrong about that too, because monsters were very real, and sometimes they took your family away piece by piece. Jake told the reporter that fear was for people who had something to lose, and she asked him what he meant, and he said she would understand someday if she was unlucky enough. The alien champion emerged from their ship just before noon, and Jake saw him for the first time and understood why 17 star systems had fallen to the Zephyrians, because Kethfa, the Unbroken, was not just a warrior but a force of nature. Made flesh, he was 8 feet tall with 4 arms that ended in claws like curved knives, and his skin was covered in natural armor that looked harder than steel, and his eyes burned like stars, and when he moved he flowed like liquid death. Keth had killed champions from dozens of worlds, and some of them had been giants, and some had been faster than light, and some had been able to breathe fire, but all of them were dead now, and their worlds were slavist. Alien warrior entered the arena and performed ritual movements that looked like a deadly dance, and each motion was perfect and controlled and designed to kill, and Jake watched from outside the energy barrier and felt nothing except the familiar weight in his chest. The crowd fell silent as Kethver finished his ritual and turned toward where Jake would enter, and the alien's burning eyes found him through the barrier, and for a moment they stared at each other across the space between worlds. Jake stood up from the bench and walked toward the arena entrance, and every step felt like walking underwater because time seemed to slow down and he could hear his heartbeat and his breathing and the whisper of his clothes against his skin. Captain Hunter made one last attempt to stop him and said this was insane and Jake would be killed in seconds and humanity would be doomed, and Jake said that humanity was probably doomed anyway, but at least this way it would not be Hunter's fault. The arena entrance dilated open like a mechanical iris, and Jake stepped through, and the energy barrier sealed behind him, and suddenly he was alone with the creature that had never been defeated. The platform was smooth and slightly warm under his feet, and the energy walls rose up around them like invisible glass, and beyond them he could see thousands of faces watching, and above them the alien cameras floating and recording everything. Kethver spoke in a voice like grinding rocks, and his words were translated by the arena's systems, and he said that he had fought warriors who were stronger and faster and better trained than this pathetic human, and they had all died screaming. Jake looked up at the alien champion and said he was not a warrior, and Kethver asked what he was then, and Jake said he was just a man with nothing left to lose. The alien emperor's voice boomed across the arena, and he spoke about the glory of combat and the honor of victory and the inevitable defeat of yet another inferior species, and Jake tuned him out because speeches were for people who cared about audiences. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring, which he had stopped wearing after Lisa died because it hurt too much to see it on his finger, but he had brought it today for reasons he could not explain. He held the ring up to the light and saw Lisa's face reflected in the gold, and remembered her voice saying she loved him, and Emma's voice calling him daddy, and for a moment the weight in his chest shifted and became something else. Jake put the ring back in his pocket and looked at Kethver, who was watching him with those burning eyes, and he said he was ready to begin. A alien champion laughed and said this would be over quickly, and Jake nodded and said he hoped so because he had been waiting to die for months, and this seemed like as good a way as any. The Emperor's voice announced the beginning of combat, and Kethver moved into a fighting stance, and Jake just stood there with his hands at his sides looking like what he was, which was a broken man in jeans and a t-shirt who had lost everything that mattered. But sometimes broken things could still cut, and sometimes people with nothing left to lose were the most dangerous of all. Kethver moved like liquid lightning, and his forearms spread wide as he circled Jake, looking for the perfect angle of attack because he had done this dance 1,000 times before with 1,000 different warriors, and they had all died the same way. Jake did not move and did not raise his hands and did not take a fighting stance because he was not a fighter anymore and had not been one since he came home from Afghanistan and tried to forget what he had learned about killing the alien champion. Tested him with a quick feint to the left, and Jake did not react, and Kethver made that grinding laugh sound and said this human was even weaker than he had expected. Jake looked at the creature's burning eyes and thought about Lisa in her hospital bed when the pain was so bad she could not speak, and Emma in the morgue when he had to identify her body, and the drunk driver who got 2 years in prison for destroying his world. Kethver struck without warning because that was how he had killed the fire breathers and the metal giants and the four-armed behemoths, and his claws came down in a perfect killing arc aimed at Jake's throat, but Jake stepped forward instead of back and drove his fist into Kethver's throat with every ounce of strength he had ever possessed, and the alien's claws raked across his chest, opening for deep cuts that went down to the bone. The crowd gasped because no champion had ever willingly taken damage to land a hit, and Kethver staggered backward because no one had ever hit him that hard in the throat, and for the first time in 300 years, he felt something that might have been surprising. Felt the fire of the claw marks across his chest, but pain was just another sensation, like hunger or thirst, and he had been ignoring all of those for months now, so he ignored this too and stepped forward again. Kethver recovered quickly because he was a perfect killing machine, and he brought 2 of his arms around in a devastating combination that would have torn a normal human in half. But Jake was not fighting like a normal human anymore. He caught one of the alien's arms and used it to pull himself closer and drove his knee up into what he hoped was Kethver's solar plexus, and the alien doubled over, making a sound like escaping steam. Jake grabbed the alien's head with both hands and brought it down to meet his rising knee, and there was a wet cracking sound as chitin armor shattered and dark alien blood spattered across the platform. Kethver roared and all 4 arms came up to throw Jake off, but Jake wrapped his arms around the alien's neck and held on like a man drowning, and used his weight to drag them both to the ground. They rolled across the platform, in a tangle of limbs and claws, and Jake felt more cuts opening on his arms and back, but he kept his grip on Kethva's throat because that was the only thing that mattered now. The alien champion was stronger and faster and had 4 arms instead of 2, but Jake had something that Kethva did not understand, which was the complete absence of any desire to survive this fight. Kethva threw him off, and Jake hit the energy barrier hard enough to see stars, but he rolled to his feet and charged again because staying down was not an option for a man who had already lost everything. The alien met his charge with all 4 claws extended, but Jake ducked under them and wrapped his arms around Kethva's waist and lifted him off the ground, and drove him down onto the platform with a wrestling move he had learned in high school. 20 years ago, Kukethova landed hard, and Jake was on top of him immediately with his hands around the alien's throat and his knees pinning 2 of the 4 arms, and Kethva's remaining arms clawed at Jake's back, opening new wounds. Blood was running down Jake's arms and soaking his shirt, but he squeezed harder and felt the alien's throat beginning to collapse under his fingers, and Kethva's burning eyes began to dim. The crowd was screaming, but Jake could not hear them because all he could hear was Lisa's voice telling him she loved him, and Emma's laughter when he pushed her on the swings at the park before the world ended. Kethva made one last desperate attempt to break free, and his claws found Jake's ribs and opened cuts that went deep enough to touch bone. But Jake had been dying inside for months, and a little more dying on the outside did not matter. He squeezed until he felt something important give way in the alien's throat, and Kethva's struggles grew weaker and his burning eyes began to fade like dying stars. 47 seconds after the fight began, Kethva the Unbroken stopped moving, and Jake felt the alien's pulse stopped under his fingers and knew that the champion who had never lost a fight would never fight again. Jake stood up on shaking legs and looked down at the body of the creature that had conquered 17 star systems, and he felt nothing except empty and tired and ready to join Lisa and Emma wherever they had gone. Blood was running down his arms and chest and back and pooling on the platform beneath his feet, but he was still standing, and Kethva was not, and that was the only thing that mattered. The arena was completely silent except for the sound of Jake's labored breathing and the slow drip of his blood on the platform and the alien cameras floating overhead recording the impossible thing that had just happened. Jake looked up at the Emperor's viewing platform where the alien leader sat surrounded by his generals and advisors, and spoke in a voice that carried across the arena. Despite the energy barriers, he said the champion was dead and the fight was over, and the Zephyrians had lost according to their own ancient laws, and now they had to honor their agreement and leave Earth forever. The Emperor stared down at him with expressions that Jake could not read because alien faces were not made for human understanding, but he thought he saw something that might have been fear or confusion or disbelief. Jake wiped the blood from his eyes and looked at the crowd beyond the energy barrier and saw thousands of faces staring at him in shock because they had just watched an ordinary man from Detroit kill the greatest warrior in the galaxy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring and put it on his finger for the first time since Lisa died, and said quietly that he hoped she and Emma were proud of him wherever they were. Then Jake Martinez sat down on the platform next to the body of Kethva the Unbroken and waited to see what would happen next to a man who had nothing left to lose and had just saved the world. The silence stretched across Central Park like a held breath, and 10,000 people stared at the impossible scene. Inside the arena where an ordinary human sat bleeding next to the corpse of the greatest warrior in the galaxy, stood on his viewing platform surrounded by generals and advisors whose faces showed expressions that had no names in any human language, because they had never experienced anything like this. Defeat. The Emperor's voice, when it finally came, was different from before, and instead of the confident arrogance of certain victory, it carried something that sounded almost like confusion, and he demanded to know how this was possible. Jake looked up at the alien leader and wiped blood from his mouth, and said it was possible because Kethva had never fought anyone who did not care about dying, and the Emperor asked what he meant by that. Jake said he meant that all the other champions had something to live for and something to lose, and that made them careful and cautious and afraid, but he had lost everything that mattered months ago. So fear was just another useless emotion. The alien generals were arguing among themselves in their grinding, mechanical language, and Jake could not understand the words, but he could hear the tone, and it sounded like the kind of argument that happened when everything you believed turned out to be wrong. Captain Hunter and the human officials were running toward the arena, but the energy barriers were still active and they could only watch as Jake bled on the platform, and the aliens tried to process what had just happened to their worldview. One of the alien generals pointed at Jake and spoke rapidly to the Emperor, and Jake heard his translation device render the words as something about impossible variables and psychological profiles that did not account for suicidal determination. The Emperor raised one of his many hands and the arguing stopped, and he looked down at Jake with eyes that seemed older and more tired than they had been 47 seconds ago. He said that in 300 years of conquest, the Zephyrians had developed profiles for every type of warrior they might face, and they knew how to defeat the strong and the fast, and the clever and the brave, but they had never encountered someone who fought like Jake. Jake said he had not fought like anything and he had just done what needed to be done, and the Emperor said that was exactly what made it impossible to predict or counter. The alien leader explained that all their previous opponents had fought to win, but Jake had fought like someone who expected to die, and that changed everything about combat psychology and tactical analysis. Kethva had been trained to fight against opponents who wanted to survive the battle, and his whole fighting style was based on using their survival instincts against them, but Jake had no survival instincts left to exploit. The Emperor said this was why the human had been able to trade damage so effectively and why he had been willing to take devastating wounds in order to land killing blows, because he genuinely did not care if he lived or died. Jake said that was about right, and the Emperor asked him why he had volunteered to fight if he did not care about the outcome, and Jake said he did care about the outcome, but only for other people. He said he cared that families like his would not be torn apart by alien conquest, and that children like Emma would grow up free, and that wives like Lisa would not die because their lives were not considered worth saving. The Emperor was quiet for a long time, and Jake could see him processing this information and trying to understand how a species could produce individuals who would sacrifice themselves for abstractions like freedom and justice. Finally, the alien leader spoke again and said that the Zephyrians honored their agreements and their ancient laws, and since their champion had been defeated in fair combat, they would withdraw from Earth's solar system immediately. Jake nodded and said that was good, and the Emperor asked if he had any demands or conditions for the withdrawal, and Jake said he just wanted them to leave and never come back. Energy barriers around the arena finally deactivated, and Captain Hunter rushed onto the platform with a team of medics who immediately began working on Jake's wounds and telling him he needed emergency surgery. Jake pushed them away and said he was fine, and Hunter said he was bleeding to death, and Jake said he had been dying for months, so a little more blood loss was not going to make much difference. The medics insisted, and Jake let them bandage the worst cuts, but he refused to go to a hospital because hospitals were where Lisa had died, and he was not ready to face those memories yet. The crowd was cheering now that they understood what had happened, and someone started chanting Jake's name, and soon thousands of voices were shouting his name across Central Park. Jake looked at all the happy faces and felt nothing, because happiness was another emotion that belonged to his old life when he had reasons to feel things like joy and hope and satisfaction. A reporter managed to get past security and asked him how it felt to be the savior of humanity, and Jake said he was not a savior, and she asked what he was then, and he said he was just a guy who had lost everything and found a use for it. The alien ships began moving in the sky above them, and their massive hulls turned toward the edge of the solar system, and their engines began the process of leaving Earth forever. Jake watched them go and thought about how easy it had been in the end, and how 47 seconds of violence had accomplished what all of humanity's armies and weapons could not have achieved. The Emperor's voice came one last time over the arena's speakers, and he said that word of this victory would spread throughout the galaxy, and other species would know that humans were not to be underestimated. He said the Zephyrians had learned something important about humanity today, which was that they possessed a capacity for sacrifice that made them uniquely dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. Jake said he hoped other aliens would remember that and leave Earth alone, and the Emperor said they would, because no one wanted to face warriors who fought like Jake Martinez from Detroit. The alien leader paused and then said something that the translation device rendered as a formal expression of respect from one warrior to another, and Jake nodded because he understood that much. At least then the Emperor's ship lifted away from the park and joined the fleet in the sky, and within an hour every alien vessel had disappeared beyond the edge of human space. Jake sat on the platform, watching the sky return to normal and feeling the weight of his wedding ring on his finger, and thinking about Lisa and Emma and how they would never know that their deaths had somehow saved the world. Captain Hunter sat down beside him and said he had done an impossible thing, and Jake said nothing was impossible when you stopped caring about consequences. Hunter asked him what he was going to do now, and Jake said he was going to go home and sit in his kitchen and look at photos of his family and wait for time to pass until he could joined them, the reporter tried to interview him again and asked about book deals and movie rights and speaking tours, and Jake said he was not interested in any of that because fame was for people who wanted to be remembered. Jake stood up and walked away from the arena and the crowds and the cameras, and no one tried to stop him because he had earned the right to leave on his own terms. He got in his truck and drove back to Detroit while the radio played reports about the alien withdrawal and the hero who had saved humanity, but Jake turned it off because he was not a hero. He was just a broken man who had found a way to make his pain useful for 47 seconds, and that was enough. Jake drove through the night while the world celebrated behind him, and by the time he reached Detroit, the news was calling him the greatest hero in human history, but he just wanted to go home to his empty apartment and his kitchen table and his photographs. The streets were full of people celebrating and setting off fireworks and honking car horns, but Jake drove past them all like a ghost returning to a graveyard, because that was what his life had become. He climbed the stairs to his apartment and unlocked the door and sat down at his kitchen table where Lisa and Emma smiled at him from their frames, and he told them quietly that he had done something important today. The phone rang and kept ringing because reporters and government officials and military leaders all wanted to talk to the man who had saved humanity, but Jake unplugged it because he had nothing left to say to a world that had taken everything from him. Over the following days, people came to his door and knocked and called his name, but Jake did not answer because he had completed his purpose, and now he just wanted to be left alone with his memories and his grief. The president called him personally and offered him medals and honors and money, but Jake said he did not want any of those things, and the president asked what he did want, and Jake said he wanted Lisa and Emma back. The military offered him any job he wanted, and scientists wanted to study him, and psychologists wanted to understand him, but Jake turned them all away because being a hero was a burden he had never asked for. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, the news of Kethvares' defeat spread through the Zephyrian Empire like wildfire, and for the first time in centuries the aliens began to question their own invincibility. Other alien species heard the story and whispered about the humans, who could produce warriors that fought like demons. When they had nothing left to lose and several planned invasions were quietly cancelled, the Carithian hegemony had been preparing to attack Earth's outer colonies, but their war council voted to find easier targets after watching recordings of Jake's 47-second victory. The Thraxian swarm had considered humanity weak and primitive, but their hive mind calculated that any species capable of such desperate courage was too dangerous to provoke. 3 months after the fight, Jake received a letter from a widow in Kansas whose husband had died in Afghanistan, and she thanked him for showing the world that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. When they had 2 more letters came from other broken people who had lost everything and found inspiration in his story, and Jake read them all sitting at his kitchen table. But he never answered any of them. A year passed, and the legend of Jake Martinez grew in the telling and spread across the galaxy, through trade routes and diplomatic channels and alien taverns where species from 100 worlds gathered to drink and gossip. The story changed in the telling, as stories always do, and sometimes Jake was described as a giant, and sometimes as a master of ancient fighting techniques, and sometimes as a man possessed by the spirits of his ancestors, but the core truth remained the same, which was that an ordinary human with nothing left to lose had defeated the greatest warrior in the galaxy in single combat, and saved his species from slavery. Jake did not care about the legend because legends were for other people and he just wanted to be left alone, but the world would not let him disappear completely. On the anniversary of the fight, the mayor of Detroit declared it Jake Martinez Day and held a parade in his honor, but Jake stayed in his apartment and looked at his photographs. The governor of Michigan offered to name a highway after him, and the president wanted to put his face on a postage stamp, but Jake declined all honors because he had not fought for glory. Young men and women came to his neighborhood hoping to meet him and learn from him, and some of them had lost family too and thought he might understand their pain. Jake felt sorry for them because he knew that pain was not something you could learn from or overcome, but only something you carried until it became part of who you were. 5 years after the fight, Jake was diagnosed with cancer, and the doctors said it was probably related to the alien claws that had torn through his chest. But Jake said it did not matter. He refused treatment because treatment was for people who wanted to live, and he had been ready to die since the day Emma was buried, and this seemed like as good a time as any. The news media found out about his illness and wanted to do stories about his brave battle against cancer, but Jake said there was nothing brave about dying and asked them to leave him alone. In a cold winter evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table looking at the photos of Lisa and Emma and feeling the cancer eating away Inside him, like a slow fire, he picked up Lisa's picture and traced her face with his finger and remembered their first date when she had laughed at his jokes and made him feel like the luckiest man alive. He picked up Emma's picture and remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle and how proud she had been when she finally did it without his help and how she had hugged him so tight. Jake put the pictures down and looked out his window at the stars that no longer held alien fleets planning humanity's conquest, and he thought about how 47 seconds of violence had bought safety for billions of people. He had never wanted to be a hero and had never asked for fame or glory and had never sought recognition for what he had done. Because heroes were supposed to be noble and inspiring, Jake knew he was neither noble nor inspiring, but just a broken man who had found a way to make his brokenness useful for a brief moment when the world needed someone who did not care about dying. The cancer took him on a Tuesday morning in March, and he died quietly in his sleep at the kitchen table with his head resting next to the photographs of his family. The funeral was attended by thousands of people, including presidents and generals, and ordinary citizens who wanted to pay their respects to the man who had saved humanity. But Jake would not have cared about any of that, because by then he was somewhere else entirely, sitting at a different kitchen table with Lisa and Emma, were waiting for him to come home across the galaxy. Alien species still tell stories about the human champion who defeated Kethfer the Unbroken, and they use his name as a warning to anyone who might threaten Earth. They say that humans are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose, and that somewhere among the billions of people on that blue world there might be another Jake Martinez waiting for his moment. The legend ensures that Earth remains free and safe because no alien empire wants to test whether humanity might produce another warrior who fights like a man already dead. And in a small apartment in Detroit, the photographs of Lisa and Emma Martinez still sit on a kitchen table where a broken man once found the strength to save the world.